Welcome back. Today we're going to be doing Array-1, of course, this section right here. But before we get started, like with string1, we're going to review some stuff. So I want to review and also introduce some things about arrays here before we get started. So basically, here's what an array is. So an array is, you can think of it as just an ordered sequence of variables. You can put as many variables as you want into an array, and you can access each variable based on a number. The first variable, they use indices like strings, so first variable is at index 0, second is at index 1, third is at index 2, etc., up until the number of variables you have in your array. So those variables are called the elements of the array, or I just call them the items in the array. And an array can have any number of items you want. So the way you create an array is first you have to specify what type are the items or the elements of the array going to be, right? Is this going to be an array of ints or of strings or of booleans? You have to specify that. So let's say I want to make an int array. The way you make an int array, well, first of all, the way you denote the type, because remember every variable has a type. So the way you denote the type int array is you type int and then you do open bracket, close bracket. And these are square brackets here. So this type here is int array. And so I can create a variable like this, and now I have a variable whose type is int array. And so if you want to actually create an int array, the way you do that is you type new and then int array, and then inside of these brackets here, not the first pair of brackets, but this pair of brackets, you put in the size of the array, that is the length of the array. So this is how we could create an array. Now, by default, the values in the array, so the values at each index, this array would go from indices 0 to 4 inclusive, right? Because it has 5 total elements and indexing starts at 0. So by default, if you create an array like this, then the elements are going to have their default values. And so let me tell you what the default values are for different things. So if you have any reference type, so string is really the only reference type we use, but also for any other reference type, then the default value is null. And I'll talk about what null means in just a second. If you have the type int, the default value is 0, boolean, the default value is false, char, the default value is, I told you how every character has a number assigned to it, so the default value for char is the character that has the number 0 assigned to it. So 0, the character, like, or I guess I should say the character corresponding to 0. And then, which is the actual character in question here is just some character that you're never going to use or see ever. But there is a character that corresponds to 0. It's not a visible character either, like F or any character I could type, any letter. And then if you take the type double, which we mentioned briefly, the default value is 0.0. So those, for all the types we know so far, I believe these are all the types we know so far, then these are the default values. So let me tell you what null means. So we have, let's say, a string variable here. Call it stir. So normally, right, this string variable would store some memory address here. Let's just say that is the memory address, and we know that this would point to a cell in memory, and starting at that cell would be actually the data of my string. Let's say it's length 3. This is, one way it might be represented. And the text it contains is HEY. Hey, that's my string. Okay, sure. But if you want to signify that, like, the absence of a variable here, like that there's nothing here, instead of putting an actual memory address here, you can put what's called null. And so null doesn't point to anywhere. It basically says that, like, there's nothing stored in this variable. So yeah, that's basically what null means. And if you try to, let's say you have a string, I'll call it stir, and I'll just set it equal to null by default. So if you ever try to do something from a variable, like call a method from a variable that's null, so like if I tried to print out stir.length, well, first of all, just logically, we can think, like, if this string is null, Like if the string like doesn't exist, then like what's its length, right? It doesn't. The question doesn't really make sense. So if I try to print this out, my program will crash. Um, I'll get what's called a null pointer exception, and you can now kind of understand what this means, right? Because we talked about how that memory address is also called a pointer, and the pointer in this case is null, and that's not allowed if you're trying to call a method from it. So as you can tell, in general, you don't want to be, having null things, but sometimes you use null to signify like the absence of a variable. We haven't had to deal with null so far because the author of CodingBat has never, passed us null to one of our methods or like, asked us to handle null, the possibility of an input being null. So that's what null means. All right. Now, another thing to note here is that arrays are also reference types. So um, and I think I'll get back to that in just a second after I tell you a few more of the things you can do with arrays, and then we can talk about how they're represented behind the scenes and how they're reference types. But let's actually talk about what you can do with them, because right now we can just create arrays, but we can't really do anything with them. So if you want to get the element at a specific index in the array, all you have to do is type the name of the array, and then in square brackets, the element you want to access. So R at index 0, the element at index 0 would be the first element in the array. And we know that, right, all the elements in this array, all 5 elements have the value 0 because they have their default values by default. Obviously, that's what the word default means. But if I print this, this will print out 0 because the first element in my array is 0. So that's great, but what if I want to actually set the value at a specific index to, some value other than the default value? So the way you do that is you can basically use the elements at each index as if they were like their own variables. So like r at 0, I can just assign to it like a regular variable. I can say this equals 27. And now when I print out r0, I get 27, right? I could print out, the value at index 1, and that would of course print out 0. I could print out the value at index 2, and that'll be 0 as well. I could do indices 3 and 4, and those would all be 0. So this is the contents of my array right now. All right, so let's talk about what else we can do with arrays. Let me show you an alternative way to create an array, because oftentimes when you're declaring a new array variable, when you're making a new array, you already know what values you want it to have by default, or maybe you just want it to have those values always. So let's say I wanted my array to contain the numbers like 7, 8, 9, 10. Um, yeah, so that's 4 numbers, and let's say I wanted to do that. So I might create an array like counting that says that has those numbers, right? So right now, using what I've told you so far, the way we'd have to do that is we'd have to say create an int array like this of length 4, where the values are all 0 by default. And then I have to say like index 0 equals 7, index 1 equals 8, index 2 equals 9, and index 3 equals 10, right? So that's kind of tedious. Don't know if you noticed. So it's kind of annoying, right, that I have to do 4 lines of code to assign to everything in here. It'd be really nice if I could do this all in one line, and fortunately you can. So here's how you could do that. So instead of, declaring it, just giving it its length where they all have the default values and then assigning to them, you can instead write it like this. So what you can say is you can say when you're, putting in the value of the variable, instead of passing a number here for the size of the array, you just put 2 brackets, and then after those brackets, you put in curly braces the elements of your array. So I could just say 7, 8, 9, 10. And this basically is going to do the exact same thing as our code before was doing. So now I can again print out, I'm going to comment out these prints here so you can see what's going on with this array only. So I can print out, the number at index 0 and then at all of the other indices as well. So I can do index 2, index 3. And there we go. It prints out the elements of my array. We can see it is working as expected. Now, let's see. Now let's go ahead and talk about how arrays are reference types and how they work in memory. So they work very much like strings. Um, let's say I have an array here. We'll call it ARR. And it has, some memory address, 349771. Sure, why not? And then this is going to point to some index in memory. Let's say, actually, yeah, let's say it goes here. And starting at that index is going to be the contents of the array. And let's say it contains like the numbers 1, 2, 3. So maybe starting here, we see 1, 2, 3. So that is how arrays work. It's very much like strings because they, again, are just reference types. And that means you could also assign an array to null if you wanted to. You could, you could have two different arrays that have the same contents but have different memory addresses. And so therefore, we would not want to use equals equals to compare two arrays. So let's talk about how actually we can compare two arrays to test if their contents are equal. So I'm going to make a new array called counting2, and I'll set it equal to, again, a new int array, and I'll make it contain the exact same elements. Now, whenever you use new, and by the way, I need to put those brackets, whenever you use new, it is creating a new thing in memory. So it's allocating like a new space in memory. And therefore, whenever I created my first counting1 array, let's say it allocated memory right here, when I created counting2 array, maybe it allocated the memory down here. So obviously counting1 and counting2, those variables are going to store different pointers. And since we know equals equals just compares the pointers, the actual values of the memory addresses, they will not compare as equal. And we can see that here. If I print out does counting1 equal counting2, and I guess the first one's just called counting2. I'm going to rename this one here. Okay, if I print this out, we see that the answer is false. They are not equal according to equals equals, because this is just comparing the memory address. Now, if you want to actually compare the contents of the array, here's how you do that. You type arrays, the word arrays with a capital A. I'll explain what's going on here in just a second. And then you do dot equals, and then you just pass to this function counting1 and counting2, your two arrays. And this will print out true, because this actually compares the contents of the array. Now, let's talk about what actually this thing is. So arrays here, this is a class, and the class contains a bunch of what are called utility methods, which are just like helpful, useful methods that can help you work with arrays, unsurprisingly. And so this is kind of like the math class, which contains a bunch of useful methods relating to math and numbers. So that's basically what this class is, and then equals is just a method that was written inside of that class, because we talked about how classes have a bunch of methods contained within them. Now, if you want to access the arrays class, like if you want to have access to this method here, what you have to do is at the top of your program, you have to add this line right here. I'm in an IDE that added this line automatically for me, but you would have to do it manually if you were in something else. So you have to add this line of code at the top. And what this says is import, which is like importing, making it so that I have access to this code, so that I have access to the arrays class. That's what this line is doing. This thing, java.util.arrays, this is like the full name of the class. Like how you have like a first name and last name, people just call you by your first name, but sometimes we need to know your full name. This is the full name of the arrays class, and so that's how you import it there. Now CodingBat actually has this line like implicitly written for us, so we don't have to explicitly write this, and we will still have access to the arrays class, which is pretty useful. So let's see what else we can talk about with arrays. One thing that is probably going to be useful for you is if you want to get the length of an array, you can just simply do the name of the array dot length, and that'll give you the length of the array. And notice that we do not put parentheses after the word length, because this is not a method. So don't get that confused with strings and arrays. Strings, you do dot length with parentheses. Arrays, you do dot length without parentheses. So Now, you might be wondering, if we go back to the equals method, you might be wondering, why don't we just do counting1 dot equals counting2, right? Why are there so many different ways to test if things are equals? We have equals equals, we have dot equals, like if I, said one thing dot equals another thing, right? We have that way, and then we have this other way, arrays dot equals, to test if two arrays are equal. Um, and the reason is because arrays are kind of special reference types that are treated specially by the language. And so therefore some usual expectations we have about reference types aren't exactly true for arrays. So to test if the contents of an array are equal, of two arrays are equal, then you have to use the arrays.equals method. And let's see what else can we talk about with arrays. Um, Okay, one last thing I'll mention is that if you want to get a nice string representation of an array, there's another useful method in the arrays class. So let's say I wanted to get a nice representation of my counting1 array, but as just a single string, like all on one line, instead of like printing them out each on separate lines like this. So here's how I could do that. I'm commenting out all the print lines so that it doesn't clutter up my console. So what I'm going to do is I can call the method arrays.toString, and then I just pass the single array that I want to print out the contents of. And you can see it gives you a nice representation of the array as a string, like this. It starts with open brackets, ends with closed brackets, and then contains each element separated by comma space. So that is a nice, another useful method of the arrays class. There are other methods in there which you can look into if you'd like to, but they're not very important for the CodingBat problems. So that is arrays. One final thing I'll say, I keep saying one last thing, is that if you're creating an array variable like this, and let's say you already know the values you want to put into it, so only in this specific situation, if you're declaring the variable and assigning to it as you declare it, like this line here is doing, and this line here is doing, you can omit this part here that I'm about to delete, and it will still be fine. It will know that, hey, I know you're assigning to an int array because you're declaring an int array here. So it'd be kind of redundant to say new int array. But they are exactly equivalent. So this part here that I highlighted is exactly equivalent to this part here. You can omit this part, new int array, just as convenience when you're declaring a variable and assigning to it right away. Note that I could not omit it if I tried to, assign this to something else. Like, let's say I now assigned my array to this thing here. That would not work. In this case, I would need to have this piece here in order for this to work. So yeah, only in this specific situation when you're declaring a variable and assigning to it as you declare it, can you omit the new int array section. And now I haven't shown you examples of arrays of other types like booleans or strings, but they are, they behave exactly the same, exactly as you would expect. There's nothing special there. All right, so now I think we have our toolkit, we have our tools, and we can go ahead and solve some CodingBat problems. So let's go over and do that. All right, let's get started with Array-1. Let's start with first-last 6. Given an array of ints, return true if 6 appears as either the first or the last element in the array. The array will be length 1 or more. Go ahead and pause and try this. All right, so let's see how we can do this. So if you want to get the first element of an array, remember that the first element is at index 0. So the first element of my array is going to be num0. If I want to get the last element of the array, well, let's think about this. Let's look at this first array here. This array has 3 elements, but the indices go 0, 1, 2. So notice that the length of the array is 3, but the last index, the index of the last element that is 2. Likewise, for this array, the length is 4, but the last element has index 3. On this one, the length is 5, but the index of the last element is 4. So we can see that the index of the last element will always be one less than the length of the array. So if I want to get the last number in this array, I can do nums at the element at nums.length minus 1. That'll be 1 less than the length. And this says return true if 6 appears as either the first or the last element in the array. So I'm just going to say return if first equals 6 or, last equals 6. And that will do the job. We can go over to the operator precedence table and see that equals equals has higher precedence than or, so this is being evaluated how we want it to. If you are concerned, if you want to, dig into the operator precedence there. All right, and of course we could shorten this. We could put this all into one thing without using variables, and that would work as well. All right, so given an array of ints, return true if the array is length 1 or more, and the first element and the last element are equal. This should be very straightforward, given what we just did on the last problem. Go ahead and pause and try this. All right, so I'm just going to jump straight to it. So we need to return true if the array length is 1 or more. So we didn't have to do that on the last one. So basically, if the length of the array is 0, right? Because if it's not length 1 or more, then its length has to be 0. It's kind of like strings, right? The length cannot be negative, but it can be 0. So if the length of the array is 0, then it obviously is not length 1 or more. And so therefore I should just return false. And otherwise, if it is length 1, and I now know that if I get past this if statement, then I know the length of the array is 1 or more, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to return true if the first and last element are equal. So does nums0 equal nums at nums.length minus 1? And there you have it. That will do the trick. Notice that I can, if I want to, do this all in one line. I can say return nums.length is greater than or equal to 1. I could also say not equal 0. They would mean the same thing in this case. So return if the length of the array is greater than or equal to 1 and the first element equals the last element. And this would be fine. This part here, num0, would never give me an exception. It would never crash my program because I know that this will never be evaluated when the length of the array is 0. Because in order to get to this statement, this part, or to get to this expression, this expression that I just highlighted there has to evaluate to true. So we talked about this with short circuiting with the AND operator here. So this single line will do the trick very nicely here. You can look at their solution and they do pretty much the same thing. These parentheses around the thing they're returning are not required, but you can put them if you want to. Let's go on to the next one. All right, this says given an array, return an int array, length 3, containing the first 3 digits of pi, 314. Pause and try this. All right, hopefully this one's not too hard. So I'm going to make an int array called pi, and so I can create it with the given default values like this, and then I'm just going to return the array that I created. There we go. That will solve the only test case. Notice that I could omit the new int array part if I wanted to, as we talked about at the beginning. If I wanted to do this all in one line, I would have to do new int array 314. This would do it as well. I'm creating basically the array in line. I'm not putting it in a separate variable and then returning it. And notice that I cannot omit this part now. If I try to run this, the compiler will not know what I'm talking about. So remember, the new int array here, when you're using default values, can only be omitted when you are creating a variable and assigning to it as you create it. So I'll have to do it like that. All right, given two arrays of ints, a and b, return true if they have the same first element or they have the same last element. Both arrays will be length 1 or more. Go ahead and pause and try this. All right, so we can actually do this in one line, I believe, but I'm gonna space it out to make it clearer first. So let's just get the first element of A and the last element of A, and let's get the first element of B and the last element of B. So that'll be 4 variables, and then we can just compare them to get our result. So the first element of A will be A at 0, And notice that I do not have to check the length of the arrays because it guarantees me that both arrays will be length 1 or more. So the last value in the array A will be at a.length minus 1. And notice that I can, because I'm creating multiple variables, and these variables are all of the same type, I can do them in one line like this. I believe we've talked about that before. But this is basically what I have right now on the screen is the same as this. It's just creating both of the variables on one line, making it a little more concise. And I could keep going. I could create the other two variables on the same line here, but I'll make a new line so that I don't go off the screen. And then first B is going to be B at index 0. Last B is going to be at b.length minus 1. Notice the style choice. Why am I capitalizing this A here and B? Obviously, I don't have to capitalize them, but I talked about in the beginning about camel case, how if you're creating a variable that has multiple words in it, like the name of the variable has multiple words in it, you capitalize the first letter of every variable, of every name that is not of every word that's not the first word. So like in this method name here, commonEnd, you see that the first word common is not capitalized, but every other word, if there are more words, would be capitalized. So let's actually finish this problem. So we have the first element of and last element of both arrays. So it says return true if they have the same first element or the same last element. So I'm going to return if first A equals first B. That'll be if they have the same first element, or if last A equals last B. And there you go. You can put this all into one line if you want to. I'll let you do that on your own if you'd like. Alright, given an array of ints of length 3, return the sum of all the elements. Go ahead and pause and try this. Okay, let's do it. My volume just spiked. Hopefully that wasn't too loud for you. Okay, so we need to sum all of the elements in this array, and we know that the array is length 3, which makes things actually quite a bit easier than if we did not know the length of the array. So let's calculate the sum. So all I need to do is add the element at index 0 plus the element at index 1 plus the element at index 2. So my sum is going to be nums0 plus nums1 plus nums2, and I can just return the sum. There you have it. We can put this all in one line too if we would like. What are you doing? CodingBat. There we go. Okay. That's how I could calculate the sum. Now, if the length of the array was unknown, so like let's say it didn't guarantee us that the length of the array was 3, but it could be any length, then we'd have to use a for loop to do this. And you actually have all the tools. In the warm-up 2 video, I went over some more advanced stuff than what we're covering in string 1 and array 1. So you actually do know, if you watch that video, you actually do have all of the tools to solve this problem if you didn't know the length of the array. You'd have to use a for loop. I won't write that here. We'll write plenty of problems using arrays and for loops later. But yeah, if you want to go ahead and try this one without knowing the length of the array, try writing a solution that does not rely on the length of the array, then I would recommend you go pause and try that. But let's go on to the next one. All right, given an array of ints of length 3, return an array with the elements rotated left. So for example, 1, 2, 3 yields 2, 3, 1. Look at the examples if you need more help understanding that. And one thing I'll say before you pause is that if you want to make a new array, you can do that, or you can just modify the given array and then return the given array back. So whichever way you'd like to do it. Go ahead and pause now and try this. All right, let's do it. So let's see. I think I'll show you both solutions actually. So creating a new array I think is actually easier, and I think more like intuitive and clear to see what's going on. So I'm going to do that first. So I'll just create an array. I'll just call it copy. And basically in this array, I'm going to put the elements of nums, but in their new order. So originally the order was 1, 2, 3, and now basically the elements at indices 1 and 2 are shifted left, and the element that was at index 0 is moved to the end. So in other words, originally the indices were 0, 1, 2, like, you know, the 0th, element at index 0 went at index 0. But now, if I were to, I'm not articulating this very well. If I were to map the indices of the original array to where that element ended up in the new array, so the element at index 0 ended up at index 2. Element at index 1 ended up at index 0. And then the element at index 2 ended up at index 1. So all I need to do is put in the elements of nums in a different order, in the new order. So the first element is the one that used to be at index 1. Second element is the one that used to be at index 2. And the third element is the one that used to be at index 0. Okay, and then I can just return the copy. All right, so that's how we could do that. If we needed to modify the original array, so instead of creating a new copy array, if we were to just modify nums by assigning two different elements in nums, we can do it like that as well. I'll show you how to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first grab the number that was at index 0. Since I'm assigning to this array, I'm going to be overwriting the elements that are in the indices already. So when I overwrite the first item in the array, I need to store that so I can use it later. Because if I just overwrite it, I'm going to obliterate it, and I'm not going to know what it was anymore. So before I overwrite the first element, I'm going to store it in a variable for later. So the first number in the array is going to be num0. And then I'm going to assign the value at the element at index 0 to the one that used to be at index 1. Now I'm going to assign what was at index 1 to what's at index 2. And now I'm just going to assign the last element in the array, nums2, to first. And hopefully you see why we needed the first variable here, why I couldn't just say nums0 right here. Because if I just said num0 right here, well now num0 stores what nums1 originally had, which is not what I intend, right? I want num0, like what I want to put in nums2 is what nums0 originally was, which is why I store it in a first variable here. If you want to see what's actually happening, first let me actually show you that this works. If you want to see what happens if I don't use this first variable, and I just do this, you can go ahead and see what the results look like and why you do need this first variable. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the next one. All right, reverse 3, given an array of ints length 3, return a new array with the elements in reverse order. And I believe you can also just modify the existing array in this problem if you'd like to. But go ahead and pause and try this. All right, let's do it. I think making a copy is the easiest way to do this. So I'm going to say int array copy equals new int array just containing the elements in reverse order. So nums2, nums1, nums0, and then just return the copy. And of course we can omit this. And if you wanted to do this all in one line, we can do it like so. All right, now if you wanted to assign stuff here, if you wanted to do this by modifying the existing array, we could do that as well. So here's how we could do that. I'm again going to store the first value in a variable. Then I'm going to say nums what is in that spot gets assigned to whatever is at the end, and then the thing at the end, the last element, gets assigned to what the first element used to be. And then return nums. So that would do it as well. But obviously the first way we did it is a bit more concise and cleaner. And it also really follows the directions better because the directions say return a new array. So that would be an array other than nums. So let's go ahead and do that solution. All right, given an array of ins, length 3, figure out which is larger, the first element or the last element in the array, and set all the other elements to be that value. Return the changed array. So the instructions say to modify the elements in the existing array, but I think you're also allowed to return a copy. But yeah, I would, though what I would do is I would follow the directions and actually, modify the given array instead of creating a new one. But go ahead and pause and try this. All right, so step 1 is to find the maximum value. So the maximum value in the array is going to be the maximum of the first element and the second element with the third element. So if you need to go ahead and pause and think about why would this thing here calculate the maximum value of the three numbers, you can go ahead and do that, right? Or basically a short way of explaining it is that this part here finds the maximum value out of the first and second element. So now that I know the max out of the first two, I then compare that with the third element. And so I take the max of whatever the max of the first two was and the third element. And if I get the max of all of those, that will give me the maximum value in the array overall. So now that I have the maximum value in the array, I'm going to assign every index to the maximum value. And of course, in one of these assignments here, I will be doing nothing, right? Because I'll just be assigning the same value that was already in that spot. But that's fine. I don't really care that I'm doing that. It will be totally fine. So I can just return nums. And let's see. Oh, sorry. I should probably read directions a bit better. It says which is larger, the first or last element. Okay, so we don't actually care about that middle element. So I can just say the first or last element. There we go. All right, that's a bit better. Maybe reading the directions is a good strategy. Okay, so yeah, so this is the first element. This is the last element. We only care about those two. We only want to find the maximum out of those two, and then that is how we can do it. All right, wonderful. And let's see how they did it. Pretty much identically. All right, given an array of ints, return the sum of the first two elements of the array. If the array length is less than 2, just sum up the elements that exist, returning 0 if the length is 0. So now we have to do some bounds checking, some index checking, some size checking. So go ahead and pause and try this. All right, so there are a few ways to do this. You can say if the length of the array is 0, so if there's no elements in the array, we're just going to return 0 as the directions say. If the length of the array is 1, we're going to return just the first element, because that will be the sum of the array, right, if it only contains one element. And then otherwise, we know the length is 2 or more. If I get past both of these if statements, the length of the array must be 2 or more. So I can just return the sum of the first two elements as the directions say. So there we go. There are other ways to approach this. Another way that comes to mind is by starting off with a sum variable equal to 0 and saying if the length of the array is at least 1, then we add the first number to the sum, and then we say if the length of the array is at least 2, we add the second element to the sum, and then we return the sum. That's another way of doing this. If we wanted to, we could nest these if statements, because we know, right, that the length of the array is not going to be greater than or equal to 2 unless it's greater than or equal to 1. So this code I have now and what I had just a second ago are going to be equivalent. So yeah, and I guess this could go up here. It does not really matter. So plenty of ways to do every problem. Those are just a couple alternatives. There are other ways to do it as well. So there you go. All right, given two int arrays, A and B, each length 3, return a new array, length 2, containing their middle elements. So this one you definitely will need to create a new array. Go ahead and pause and try this. All right, so I can get the middle value of A by doing A at index 1. Again, this is because I'm guaranteed that the lengths of the arrays are both going to be 3. So the middle value of A is going to be A at index 1, and the middle value of B is going to be B at index 1. And it just says return an array containing length 2 containing their middle elements, so mid A and mid B. Pretty straightforward. Now, if you didn't know the length of the array, so let's imagine for a second that it didn't say that the length of the array was 3. Imagine it just said that the length of the array is odd. So we don't know the length of the array, we just know that it is odd. So if you wanted to find the middle index of an array, when all you knew about the length of the array was that it's odd, you could say a.length over 2. And keep in mind that this is going to do int division. So, right, because obviously if you divide an odd number by 2, you're going to get a number that ends in 0.5. But when you do int division, it truncates the number down towards 0. So 1.5 becomes 1, 7.5 becomes 7, etc. So if a.length was 3, then 3/2 would do int division, and then the result would be 1. So this would be a at index 1. So again, just, ways we can make our solution more general. We don't need to because it guarantees us that the length of the arrays are 3. But in other problems, as we get into later sections, obviously we won't be guaranteed that the length of the array is any specific number. Alright, given an array of ints, return a new array length 2 containing the first and last elements from the original array. The original array will be length 1 or more. Alright, go ahead and pause and try this. Alright, hopefully pretty straightforward. I'm not even going to create any variables. I'm just going to skip straight to the point. So the first element is at num0, the last element is at nums.length minus 1. Pretty straightforward. I'm not even going to spend time explaining that. Alright, now given an array length 2, return true if it contains a 2 or a 3. Go ahead and pause and try this. So this is a bit overkill, but I'm going to do a helper method. So I'm going to say public boolean contains. So it's going to take in an array and a number, I'll just call it val, and it's going to return true if the given array nums contains val. And I'm going to assume, I'll write this in a comment, I'm going to assume that nums.length is 2. So nums contains val if either the first element is val or the second element is val. And all I have to do now is say return contains 2 or contains 3. There we go. Obviously this is overkill. You could do this all in one line in the original method, but this is just an example of how we could use a helper method. And again, right, this problem is a lot easier when they guarantee us that the length of the array is going to be 2. If they didn't guarantee us that, if the length of the array could be any number, then our solution would have to be a bit more complicated. I would again encourage you to pause the video and try to figure out a solution to this problem that does not care about the length of nums. So like, in other words, that does not make that assumption there. So if you want to try writing a contains method that does not care about the length of nums, then I would encourage you to pause and do so because you do have all of the tools to do that. But you can go ahead and try that on your own. We'll get to problems like that later. All right, let's keep going. All right, so now we're given an int array of length 2. We need to return true if it does not contain a 2 or a 3. Go ahead and pause and try this. All right, so let's see how we can do this. So keep in mind, let's see, that it needs to not contain a 2 and not contain a 3. So let's see what we can do about that. So like before, I'm actually just going to write a contains method, especially since I've already wrote it. I can just copy and paste it here. So yeah, generally, by the way, you don't want to copy paste code. That's actually kind of the whole point of writing methods, is that we don't have to copy paste code. But of course, CodingBat does not let you refer to methods you wrote in previous problems. So that's why I do have to copy paste this. If you were working on your own, project, you would have to only write this method once, and then you could call it from anywhere. But of course, this is on CodingBat, and I can't refer to methods I wrote in other problems. all the code has to be self-contained in this little box here. So I'm going to just copy my contains method. Then I'm going to say return true if nums does not contain that. So basically it says return true if it does not contain a 2 or a 3. So if it contains a 2 or a 3, then I would write it like that, right? So if I want to get the negation of this, if I want to say if it does not contain a 2 or a 3, all I have to do is put this in parentheses and put a not in front of it, which we know is an exclamation mark. And that is how I could do that one. Another way of writing this is like this. By changing that to an and putting a not in front of both of the contains things. And that is another equivalent way of writing it. If you want to think about logically why is that true, go ahead and do that. It's actually such a common occurrence to see something like this that it has a name. It's called De Morgan's Law. And let me actually go over to Paint for just a second to describe it to you. So basically De Morgan's Law says that if you take A or B, and you negate it, so if you negate it, I'm using Java, syntax, the Java operators you're familiar with, that this is the same as, I'm not going to use the equal sign because it's just another symbol, but that this is the same as, I'll use like an arrow, two-directional arrow. This is the same as not A and not B. And again, if you want to pause and reason to yourself why this is true, that the negation of A or B in parentheses is the same as not A and not B, then go ahead and do that. And then as sort of a corollary to the rule, or just a second part of the rule, it says basically the inverse kind of, that not A and B, I need to write the B, not A and B is equivalent to not A or not B. So yeah, that is basically De Morgan's Law, and that is why what I have now is the same as what I had before with this whole part in parentheses, and then using an or here and negating it on the outside. So yeah, that is how we could solve this one. Okay, moving right along. Given an int array, return a new array with double the length, where its last element is the same as the original array, and all other elements are 0. The original array will be length 1 or more. Note, by default, a new int array contains all zeros, which is something you should already know from the beginning of the video. Go ahead and pause and try this one. Alright, let's go ahead and do it here. So the new array should have twice the length. So I'm going to call this one, I'll just call this R, or what should I say? Yeah, I'll call it R, equals new int array, and it's going to have twice the length. So its length is going to be nums.length times 2. And then I want everything to be filled with zeros, which it already is because I know 0 is the default value. So I don't have to worry about that, but I do have to make sure the last element of R is the same as nums. So the last element of R is R at index r.length minus 1, and I need to set that equal to the last index of nums, which is going to be at nums.length minus 1 in the nums array. So then I can return R, and there we go. They did it pretty much the same way. Alright, given an int array, return true if the array contains 2 twice or 3 twice. The array will be length 0, 1, or 2. Go ahead and pause and try this. Okay, so I'm going to do a helper method because why not? Well, there are plenty of reasons why not, but I'm still going to do a helper method. Okay, so we need to return true if the array contains the number twice. So I'm going to make a method called contains twice. It takes an int array and a number. I'll just call it, val. And then this method, of course, is going to assume that nums.length is less than or equal to 2. So, okay. And note that it's generally a good idea when you're writing methods. Of course, this is like a bigger picture sort of thing. That's not going to really be relevant to CodingBat, but it's a good idea when you're writing methods to state what are the, you know, assumptions or what are the conditions that you're already assuming that the parameters satisfy. But anyway, this method is going to return true if nums contains val twice. Now, we can really take advantage of the fact that we know that the nums array will be length 0, 1, or 2. In order for the array to contain a number twice, it has to obviously have it 2 elements, right? So I'm going to return true if nums.length is greater than or equal to 2. Now, since I'm guaranteed that the length will be 0, 1, or 2, I could actually just say nums.length equals 2. So I guess I can do that. It doesn't matter in this case. Um, so I'm going to return true if the length of nums is 2 and the first element is val and the second element is val. And that will determine if nums contains val twice, again, assuming the length of nums is 2 or less. And now all I need to do is say return contains twice 2 or contains twice 3. And there you go. If you want to, you could go ahead and write this method um, uh, without assuming that the length of the array is 2 or less. So you could write this method, that works for any length of the nums array. That'll be a bit harder than any of the other things I've suggested so far. But you have the skills to do it, um, or you could do it using the skills that I've taught you so far. It'll be hard though, but you can go ahead and try that if you want. Um, let's go ahead and go to the next one though. Given an int array of length 3, if there is a 2 in the array immediately followed by a 3, set the 3 to a 0, return the changed array. Go ahead and pause and try this. Okay, so this problem asks us to modify the given array. I'm assuming you could also create a copy if you wanted to, but in this case I think it's easier to modify the given array. So in order for the array to contain a 2 immediately followed by a 3, given that we know the length of the array is 3, that number 3 must occur either in index 1 or index 2, right? Because the 3 could not occur in index 0, because then it couldn't be preceded by a 2, right, if it's in the first spot. So our two possibilities are that we have a 2, 3 in indices 0 and 1 respectively, and we have a 2, 3 in indices 1 and 2 respectively. So those are the two possibilities we need to check for. So, and we know that we can't have both at the same time. We can't have 2, 3 there and 2, 3 there because this middle spot would be conflicting, right? We don't know if it should be a 2 or a 3. It couldn't be both. So let's go ahead and test this. So if there's a 2 immediately followed by a 3, so I'm first going to handle this first case where I have 2 in index 0 and 3 at index 1. So if index 0 is 2 and index 1 is 3, then I'm going to set index 1 to 0. And then I can say, so now I've tested the possibility that it starts with 2, 3, 2, 3. And then I'm going to test if 2, 3 occurs in indices 1 and 2 respectively. So if index 1 is 2 and index 2 is 3, then I want to set index 2 to 0, and then I can return nums. Note that I don't have to do any else business here because I know these two if statements are exclusive. I know that there's no way my array could go into one and the other. It will either go into one or the other or neither. So I know for a fact that's how my code's going to work because I just reasoned through that with you. If you wanted to, you could put this in an else because you know that if the first condition was met, there's no way the second condition is going to be met. So you could do it like this if you wanted to. And note that this thing right here that I just highlighted is technically considered one statement. So I could actually omit these curly braces if I did that. And in fact, I could even, if I wanted to, because as I mentioned at the very beginning of this series, white space doesn't matter. Extra lines or tabs don't matter. Um, I could actually put this if right there too, and it would have the same effect as if I had put curly braces and put this on a new line and all that stuff. And this is actually a common thing to do in Java. This is common style, is to say if something and then else if. Um, and basically what you can think about, one way of thinking about this stuff that I have on the screen right now is that if this condition is true, I'm going to do this, obviously. Um, but only if this first condition wasn't met am I going to check this second condition. And the second condition is specified by this right here, this if statement. Um, so that's one way of thinking about this. It's going to check this first, and then if that's not satisfied, only if that's not satisfied, is it going to check this condition here. And maybe there's another else if beneath this. I have an extra indentation there. Maybe there's an extra else if that has some more conditions and then some more code, and then you could have some more else ifs until you've, uh, you know, until you have something to handle every condition you need to handle. So, plenty of ways to do stuff. But that is how we could solve that one. Alright, so let's move on to the next one. Start with two int arrays, a and b, of any length. Return how many of the arrays have 1 as their first element. Go ahead and pause and try this. Alright, so for I think the first time, the arrays can have any length. Or maybe not the first time. But we only care about the first element of the array if it's present. The arrays might have length 0, which we need to take care of. So, there are, of course, as per usual, plenty of ways to do this. I'll do just the first one that popped into my mind. So I'll have a count that'll be the number of arrays out of these two arrays that have 1 as their first element. So in order for the array A to have 1 as its first element, its length must be greater than 0, so it must not have nothing in it, and the first element must be 1. And if those conditions are true, then I've found one array that has 1 as its first element, and very similarly, I'm going to do this for B. And if that's the case, I need to increment count, and then I'm just going to return count. And there you have it. Pretty straightforward. Yeah, and again, we're taking advantage of short-circuiting, a very, very useful fact of Java, that what I've just highlighted, is only going to get evaluated if this is true. So if A does have at least one element in it, only then am I going to actually look at what that element is. If I try to look at what the element is first, and I get a exception, and my program would crash. For example, just to show you what I mean, if I were to reverse the order of these things, it would not work, and that's because of short-circuiting. So I need to put them in this order if I want to do it like this. Oops, didn't mean to click that. Okay, so start with two int arrays A and B, each length 2. Consider the sum of the values in each array. Return the array which has the largest sum. In the event of a tie, return A. Go ahead and pause and try this. Alright, so once again, I'm just going to do the first thing that popped into my head. Not saying that's the best thing to do when you're coding all the time, but on these problems, well, you know, any solution that pops into your head will probably work and won't be too long because these are not too complicated problems. Okay, so I'm gonna get the sum of the first array of array A and the sum of array B. So the sum of array A, because I know the length of array A is 2, all I have to do is add the first and second element, and the sum of array B is B0 plus B1. Okay, and then if A is greater than B, and I'm actually going to say greater than or equal to B, so that if there's a tie, it will also go into this if statement. So if the sum of A is greater than or equal to B, I'm going to return array A. Otherwise, I'm going to return array B. I could have put else here if I wanted to. Maybe you think that makes the code a bit clearer, but you don't need to because remember, whenever you hit a return statement, the method ends. So as soon as this return A statement is executed, then no more code is run. So if I enter this if statement, I'm returning A and I'm leaving the method. I'm no longer doing anything in this method. So that means I will never get to this line, this return B line, if I went into this if statement. So that's how we could do that one. You could, of course, also inline this if you really wanted to, although I don't. I think that just makes the code less readable. But anyway, moving on. Given an int array of ints of even length, return a new array length 2 containing the middle two elements from the original array. The original array will be length 2 or more. Go ahead and pause and try this. Alright, so really the only challenge here is finding how, if you're given an array of length n, where n is even, what are the indices of the middle two elements in terms of n. And if you think about that for a little while, you'll figure out that the indices are going to be at n over 2 minus 1 and n over 2. Those are going to be the indices of the two middle elements. So int array, I'll call it mid, equals the two middle elements are going to be at nums.length over 2 minus 1. PEMDAS is going to make sure that this division happens first. And nums at nums.length over 2. You don't have to worry about int division here because I know that nums.length is going to be even, and dividing an even number by 2 yields an integer, so no decimals are going to be truncated because we're not going to have any decimals. So I just return mid. I always try this keyboard shortcut, but it doesn't work for me. Okay, so this is how we could do that problem. Pretty straightforward. You could put this all in one line if you really wanted to. But yeah, some of these are just pretty simple, thinking or math kind of problems that don't require much code, and this is one of them. All right, given two int arrays, each length 2, return a new array length 4 containing all their elements. Pause and try this one. All right, so hopefully this one wasn't too hard. I just need to return a int array that contains the first two elements of A followed by the, not first two, the only two elements of A followed by the two elements of B. So A0, A1, B0, B1. Hopefully you did that one. Given an array of ints, swap the first and last elements in the array. Return the modified array. The array length will be at least 1. Go ahead and pause and try this one. Alright, so this is a classic case, or I guess not classic, but a very common case of needing to swap two elements. And I recommend you learn and honestly memorize how to swap two elements in an array, or honestly any two variables that you want to swap, because it's very often in programming that we need to swap a couple things. So basically here's what I want to do. So I have num0 and nums at nums.length minus 1. And I want to swap those two things. So, right, if I tried to, let's say I try to do this, and I said the first value is now the last value, and the last value is now the first value. Well, if I tried to do this, hopefully you can see why this is wrong. I could go ahead and return nums, and you see that this would not work. So why doesn't this work? Well, let's say we have an array like 1, 2, 3, 4. After this line is executed, the value at index 0 is set to the value at index 3. So that means that after this first line, this line I just highlighted is executed, the array now contains 4, 2, 3, 4. And then when this line is executed, when the last element is set to the first element, well, now the first element is 4. So you're just assigning the last element, which is already 4, to 4. So after this highlighted line is executed, the array still contains 4, 2, 3, 4. And then I return nums, and that gives me 4, 2, 3, 4, which is not what I want. So maybe you can see that I'm going to need to do something else here to get this to work. And the other thing I can do is I can make a temporary variable. I'll call it temp. Well, I guess all these local variables we've created so far are temporary. But I say temp as in like it's a kind of a helper variable, just like we have helper methods. That's going to help me do this task here. So I'm going to set this variable equal to num0. So this, even if this temp variable, even if num0 changes, temp stores the value that num0 had on this line. So right here, when I say num0, I'm getting whatever num0 has at this point, and I'm storing that in temp. So even if num0 changes, which it is going to change because I'm going to reassign num0 to something else, temp will still not change. So every time you create a variable, every time you assign a variable, it copies whatever you put on the right, whatever the thing is on the right, it copies that to the thing on the left. Now notice that when you have a reference type, it's only copying the memory address, right? It's not copying the thing behind the scenes, it's just copying the memory address. But when you have a primitive type, such as num0, right, is an int. Nums is an int array, but num0 is an int, and an int is a primitive type. So when you copy a primitive type, you just copy the number that it is. There's no memory addresses or anything involved. So temp is just going to be a copy of nums0, whatever num0 was, and temp is not going to change if num0 changes. If these were reference types we were dealing with, well, basically what would happen is the memory address would be copied, but the object, the actual thing in memory, wouldn't be copied. So like, to give you an example, let's say I had a string str that was, or actually let's say I had like, let me actually go over to the IDE to show you this, because it's going to be kind of hard to show you in there. Let me quickly make a demo. We'll call this references demo. So if I have an int array, call it R1, that contains the numbers, let's do actually 5, 6, 7. And then I create an int array R2. And let's say I set R2, I say R2 equals R1. So what this is going to do is it's going to copy the memory address of R1, because R1 is a reference type, right? Arrays are reference types, no matter what their element type is. Their element type could be a primitive type like int, but the array type is going to be a reference type. So since R1 is a reference type and it's being assigned, to a reference type, then I'm just going to copy the memory address. And basically what's going on is I have two different memory addresses, or sorry, two of the same memory address, right? R1 and R2 have the same memory address, which means they're both pointing to the same spot in memory. And what that means is that if let's say I change R1, let's say I set the middle element to be like, 90 instead of 6. And now if I print out Array2, go ahead and pause and think about what you think is going to happen. Is R2 going to be 567, or is R2 going to be 597, right? Remember, I assigned R1 at index 1 to 90, right? So what's going to happen to R2? Is it going to stay the same? Is it going to be 567, or is it going to change? And the answer is R2 is going to change. And again, if you think about this in terms of not method references, in terms of just like memory addresses, then this makes perfect sense. Because if I go over to pane here, I have R1 and R2, which has some memory address. I'll just say it's this number 7871. This is 7871. And my memory, all my lovely memory is over here. And let's just say here are some 3 memory, cells in memory, spots in memory. And originally they were 5, 6, 7. So both of these memory addresses point to the same place right here. So when I assign R1 at index 1 to 90, then basically what I do is this is R1 at index 1. So this gets changed to 90. But when I print out R2, if I print out R1 or R2 now, it will print out the same thing because they're pointing to the same spot in memory. So effectively, these arrays are representing the same elements. And if I change one, it'll be reflected in the other one, right? And vice versa. Now, this is different, well, somewhat different with primitive types, because primitive types, they are not references to places in memory. They are literally numbers that are their value. So I could, let's say I have, you know, I won't really need memory now anymore, but let's say I have like x equals 7, and I say y equals x, right? So whenever I do this, what this is basically saying is this is saying y gets 7, right? Just the value of x. The value of x is copied into y. So y now is 7, right? And so now if I change x, let's say I cross this out and I change x, I reassign x to 8, well, y is not going to change, right? It wouldn't make sense for y to change, right? And so that's how primitive types and reference types are different. Again, in both cases, the number, whether it be the primitive value of the thing, of the primitive type, or the memory address of a reference type, that number is just being copied. But what the number represents means that for reference types, they're both pointing to the same spot in memory, whereas for primitive types, they aren't memory addresses, they're just being copied. So changes in one will not be shown in the other. So a subtle difference, but is important to know for this problem, which is why that even though I assign temp to num0, if I change num0 later, temp will not change, because again, it's a primitive type. Hopefully I've said that enough times by now, and you get the gist of it. So how am I actually going to perform this swap here back in CodingBat? Basically, all I'm going to do is change this to temp and then return nums, and that is going to work. So you can think about what's happening. Here, I'll walk you through this code here. So let's say my array starts as 1, 2, 3, 4. So first thing I do is I assign temp to the first element. So temp equals 1. So temp equals 1, and temp is always going to equal 1. It's not going to change because I never reassign it anywhere. Okay, so temp equals 1. And then I assign the first element to the last element. So now the first element is 4, and the array contains 4, 2, 3, 4. And then on this next line, I assign the last element to temp. And temp is 1. As I said, it's 1. So now I assign the last element to 1, and therefore the array contains 4, 2, 3, 4, which is exactly what we want. So this is how we could swap things. And hopefully you can kind of see the pattern, right? This thing is the same as this thing. This thing is the same as this thing. So it doesn't matter what we're swapping. These could be two variables, two spots in an array, two anythings. And that's how the pattern would go. And then this thing is going to be the same as this thing. But yeah, that's how you can swap two things in programming, or in Java, I should say. Okay, so given an array of ints of odd length, return a new array length 3 containing the elements from the middle of the array. The array length will be at least 3. Go ahead and pause and try this. All right, so hopefully you have tried it. Let's go ahead and do it. So again, the problem, or the only real challenge here is determining the indices of the three middle elements given that the length of the array is odd. So let's call the length of the array in. We know in is odd, and let's determine what will be the indices of the middle three elements in terms of in. So hopefully, if you want to pause and think about that, the indices will be at in over 2 minus 1, at in over 2, and at in over 2 plus 1, where all those divisions were int divisions. Because obviously, if they weren't, then I'd end up with decimals, and that wouldn't make sense for indices in an array. So the middle three elements are going to be the elements at index in minus 1, in over 2 minus 1, at in over 2. And I suppose I can actually make in a variable just because I'm saying it so much and I think it'll make the code a bit clearer. So at in over 2 minus 1, at in over 2, and at in over 2 plus 1. And obviously return result. And there we go. All right, given an array of ints of odd length, look at the first, last, and middle values in the array and return the largest. The array will be at least length 1. Go ahead and pause and try this. Okay, so I'll just make 3 variables, one for first, middle, and last element in the array. So first is nums 0. Again, I don't have to do any bounds, any index checking, because I know that the length of the array is at least 1. the middle element is at nums.length, nums.length, what is this? The length is odd, so nums.length over 2 is going to be the middle element. Of course, it is doing int division. And then the last element is going to be at nums.length -1. So I need to return the largest element. And note that this will still work even if the length of the array is exactly 1. All of these 3 lines will work. So I need to return the maximum. So if you want to do the maximum of 3 things, you can just call math.max like nested within itself. Like the maximum of all 3 is going to be the same as the max of the first and mid, and compare that to the last element and take the max of those. And so that's going to do it here. Yeah, so math.max, very useful method because this would be kind of annoying to write out with if statements on multiple lines. Yeah, so that's how we could do this one. You could do this all in one line if you wanted, if you really wanted to, but I won't. So yeah, that is that one. Given an int array of any length, return a new array of its first 2 elements. If the array is smaller than length 2, use whatever elements are present. Go ahead and pause and try it. Alright, so I'm going to split this up into 3 cases. One where the array is empty, one where the array has 1 element, and the third case where the array has 2 or more elements. So if the length is 0, I'm going to return an empty array. And in fact, I could just return nums since I know nums is an empty array, but I'll create a new empty array. There. Okay. And then, let's see. And then if the length of the array, if the length of nums is 1, I just need to return an array of length 1. Of length 1 containing the exact same element as nums. Yeah, and then, let's see, and then the third case is if nums.length is 2 or greater. And since both of these if statements contain a return statement as their only, thing inside of them, I know that if I enter either of these if statements, my method is going to end. So I know that if I get down to the spot where my cursor is, I know that nums.length cannot equal 0 or 1, which therefore means that the length of the nums array is 2 or more, which means I can return a new int array containing the first element and second element safely. And there we go. Now, because I'm guessing CodingBat doesn't actually verify that you return a new array, I'm guessing that it would technically be acceptable to do what I'm about to do now and actually just return the given array if the length is 1 or less. So it looks like you can do that. Technically, this does not follow the directions because it says return a new array, and returning the given array is not returning a new array. So technically this does not follow the directions, but CodingBat doesn't verify your code that hard. So, or at least in this regard. So this is going to pass all the test cases, even though I guess it technically doesn't do what the directions say. But let's go ahead and move on. Alright, we'll say that a 1 immediately followed by a 3 in an array is unlucky. Return true if the given array contains an unlucky 1 in the first 2 or last 2 positions in the array. Go ahead and pause and try this. Alright, so you'll notice that it didn't tell us any specifications on the size of the array, which means we should assume that the size of the array, that is the length of the array, can be anything. So, first of all, if the length of the array is less than 2, so that is if it has 0 or 1 elements, then we know it can't contain an unlucky 1. So I'm just going to get that case out of here right away. So if nums.length is less than 2, return false. Okay. And then another thing is it says to check the first 2 or last 2 positions in the array, but there's no way an unlucky 1 could occur in the last position in the array because the 1 has to be followed by a 3. So we don't even need to check the last position. So we just need to check the first 2 and the second to last position. So at the point where my cursor is, we know nums.length is 2 or greater because of that if statement. So that means I am safe to check if an unlucky 1 occurs at index 0. So if nums at index 0 equals 1 and nums at index 1 equals 3, then I've found an unlucky 1 at index 0, so I can return true. Now, if I want to check for an unlucky 1 at position, uh, like where the 1 occurs at position 2, I'm going to make sure that the length of the array is at least 3, because that 1 has to be followed by another number, namely 3, so therefore the 1 cannot be at the end of the array. So if the 1 occurs in the second position, then there has to be a third position for the 3 to occur. So I could do that if I want to check for if there is a 3 in the second position. I'll have to first make sure that the length of the array is at least 3, because right now I know that the length of the array is at least 2, but I need to make sure it's at least 3. So the length of the array is at least 3, and the second element is 1, and the third element is 3. Then I've found an unlucky 1 at position, at the second position, index 1. So I can return true here. And then finally, I need to check if there's an unlucky 1 in the second to last position. So if nums at nums.length minus 2 is the second to last position equals 1, and nums at nums.length minus 1 equals 3, then I have found an unlucky 1. And then if none of these if statements are entered, I'm going to return false. I did not find an unlucky 1. So that code will help solve the problem. You could shorten this up a bit. We could, I suppose we could put these into one if statement like that. It gets pretty long if we do that, but we could do that. Let's see, how else could we clean it up? I mean, you could perhaps, make this code a bit more concise. I don't really think we need to here. This code I have will do just fine. So let's go on to the next one. All right, given two int arrays, A and B, return a new array of length 2 containing as much as will fit the elements from A followed by the elements of B. The arrays may be any length including 0, but there will be 2 or more elements available between the two arrays. Go ahead and pause and try this. Okay, so basically, since we know there's going to be 2 elements between the two arrays, there's only really 3 cases. The first case is that A has 2 or more elements, and therefore I just need to return the first 2 elements of A. The second case is that A has 1 element and B has 1 or more elements, and therefore I just need to return the first element of A followed by the first element of B. And then the third case is that A has 0 elements and B has 2 or more elements, and therefore I just need to return the first 2 elements of B. So I pretty much said the code out loud, like, in English, but I pretty much just said it, so I'm just going to type what I just said. So if A.length is at least 2, I'm going to return the first and second element of A. If A.length equals 1, and I already know that B.length is 1 or greater because of the guarantee in the problem statement, so therefore I can just return B0, and then otherwise I know that the third case has to hold again because I'm guaranteed there will be at least 2 elements between the two arrays, so I don't even need another if statement. I can just say return a new int array containing the first 2 elements of B. Alright, so there you have it. Let's go on to the next one. Given 2 int arrays, looks like we're on the last one by the way, given 2 int arrays, A and B, of any length, return a new array with the first element of each array. If either array is length 0, ignore that array. Go ahead and pause and try this. Alright, the last one, let's do it. So, let's see. I'm going to, again, split this up into 3 cases, or actually I suppose 4 cases. 1, they're both empty and I return an empty array. 2, A contains an element and B does not. I return the first element of A. Case 3, A is empty and B contains at least one element. I return the first element of B. In case 4, A and B both have at least one element, and so I return the first element of both of them. Let's go ahead and just basically type out what I just said. If A.length is 0 and B.length is 0, return an empty int array. So I could say new int array and put nothing in there, or I could say new int array with a size of 0. Either one would create an empty array. If a.length is greater than or equal to 1 and b.length is 0, I return an array just containing that first element of a. If a is empty, and by the way, there is no like isEmpty method like there was on strings. There's nothing like that for arrays. So I have to do length equals 0. If a.length is 0 and b has at least one element, then I return just the first element of b. And then otherwise, I know that the only other case that's possible is a and b both have at least one element, so I'm just going to return the first two elements of both of them. Don't need another if statement. And let's see. Oh, sorry. Not a1, but rather b0. There we go. All right. That's how we could do this one. There are some other ways to write this because there are other ways to write everything. Let me show you just one of those other ways, though. So I'm going to comment this out and just repaste it so that I can edit it. So if a.length is 0, what I could do is I could put everything else in an if statement, and then I could have like another branch within here. So I could say, well, if b.length is 0, right, and I'm only going to enter this part if a.length is 0, right? That's my first check. So if a.length is 0, then I'm going to check if b.length is 0. And if so, I'm going to return an empty array. And then otherwise, I know that if I get to this point right here where my cursor is, I know that a.length is 0 and b.length is not 0. And that is, what is that? That is this case right here. So I'm going to copy that into there. And then what I can say is, otherwise, if b.length is 0, I can say if b.length is 0. So if I get to where my cursor is now, I know that b.length is 0 and a.length is not 0, right? Because if a.length was 0, I would have just entered the first if statement, or the first, if block. So I know at the point where my cursor is that b.length is 0 and a.length is not 0. So that is this case right here. And then if I get past everything, then I know that neither array is empty. So that's another way of writing this. I could, if I wanted to, put that in an else. And if I put that in an else, I could actually do it like this. This is getting very perhaps hard to understand because I'm omitting all of the curly brackets. But I've indented it such that my indentation shows how it's going to be executed accurately. But basically, the else's, this is just like a way to help you like read code like this. The else's will always be attached. Like you can imagine an else, right? An else always comes after an if, right? I can't have like an else like all on its own. Sorry, that's not how you spell else. I can't have like an else on its own, right? An else comes after an if. So an else is always attached to the most recent if. So like the most, yeah. So this else, right? If I put it back here, it might look like it's attached to this if. But remember, right? White space doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where I indent it to. I'm just doing that for clarity. So else's are always attached to the nearest if that does not have an else on it already. So this else, right, it would attach to this if, but this if's already got an else right here. So this else will attach to this if. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. If not, you can just, again, explicitly put your curly braces if you want to. There is nothing wrong with explicitly putting in the curly braces here. You can just omit them when, if you feel like it, pretty much. All right, so that is how we could do this problem. I kind of like the second solution better. It's just clearer about all of the 4 cases that we have. So that is how we could do this one. All right, so that is the Array-1 section done. Hope you learned something today and got some practice coding. I will see you next time for Logic 1. Goodbye.